Good morning. This is Dr. Rich Bernardo, head of all Catalyst facilitators, so to speak, with my friend Joe, the alchemist behind me. I'm not quite sure what his name is, but today we'll call him Joe. And together we are trying to work you through each of the phases of the alchemy simulation, alchemy, the leadership simulation. And we're going to begin the third phase of 5 or 6 different phases, where the rubber begins to meet the road. Let's walk backwards before we go forwards by reminding you that phases 1 and 2, which kind of melt together, we could actually call them one, as in the number one, rather than 1 and 2. It doesn't matter. For the sake of conversation, we'll keep them separate. Phases 1 and 2 were parsing the purpose and information gathering. If you think about the old Bloom's taxonomy, learning triangle, the levels of thinking triangle, you can consider this the basis for or the bottom of the triangle upon which everything may rest. That isn't altogether true, because this is a kind of recursive spiraling process where things clearly fold back on each other as you begin to evolve your own learning and your own thinking. But for the sake of simplicity today, we'll say that before you do level 3, you can't do levels, you must do levels 1 and 2, phases 1 and 2. Again, nailing down your purpose, working your purposes through your team, and also in concert or communication with the other team with which you're collaborating, as well as then moving towards gathering the information that you need to have to not only have an informed purpose, but a purpose that collects and captures all of the issues that you can, which would require that you engage in a fairly sophisticated synthesis process to bring that together. An argument could be made that the information gathering phase may in fact belong before the framing the purpose. So don't get in a tizzy if you realize that you have to go backwards to go forwards or forwards to go backwards. In the end, when you come through phase 2, you will have had an agreement, a consensus on what your purpose is, and you will have come up with some strategies that you're going to use to have the information that you need to move to the next phase. And as I said a few minutes ago, this is where the rubber meets the road, he smiled. This is where you begin to future. Futuring, in my mind, in our mind, is a noun, a verb, sometimes a gerund, probably some of the other parts of speech as well, but those are the 3 that come to mind as we speak. And the bottom line is, this is where you begin to truly future. Now, even though the alchemist may have thought that he could change lead into gold, I'm not pretending to have you think that he also looked into crystal balls or read people's palms. That's how futuring sometimes becomes a pejorative. And I do not mean to imply for a moment that futuring is that at all. It's not about waiting for your grandma Tilly to tell you that there's a truck coming up behind you. None of that at all. What futuring is, and those of you who are playing the futurists in each of the 2 teams, I free you up to reiterate this point and to make it loudly and clearly whenever things begin to wander away. Futuring is really an actual way, a science, so to speak, with a small s, of forecasting. And in this case, forecasting is identifying probabilities that you think are based or substantiated on what you think the information that you have more nearly suggests. So if someone were to say to you, who's going to win the Super Bowl this coming year, you're not necessarily going to pick the last place team right now, because you've looked at some information and have some pretty strong ideas about which teams have the best capacity to go through the playoffs, get to the championship game. You're basing that on information, and what you're doing with the information is projecting and futuring. Squirrels future. This is the fall, rather to say is autumn, where I am right now at this point in the videotape. and I have squirrels scurrying all over my yard looking for acorns because they know they need those acorns for their future, farmers' future, when they build compost piles or store up the seed and the grain. We future, when we budget, I think that's a very bad example of futuring for the most part. Nonetheless, it's probably a good example with a small g, the smallest g possible, of how school districts and some organizations think that they're futuring. No, you're doing something between squirrels and between budget processes that you will have to engage in. You, in fact, are going to use some tried and true futures processes that's going to sometimes hurt your head, hurt your hair if you have any, or sometimes force you to go back to phase 2 to review your information. Remember, I said this was a recursive process in order to be sure that you can future for the best probabilities. I have said many times that there are 3 kinds of futures, what we call the 3 Ps. Actually, there's 4. We'll get to them. We'll get to the back part of the simulation. But the initial 3 Ps are what's possible, what's probable, and what's preferable. What you're going to do now is use 3 processes in this particular phase, what we call futuring 1, Roman numeral 1, before we get to some more sophisticated processes in futuring 2, where you're going to begin to more nearly squeeze down to what you think the probable futures are. Careful here. But it doesn't mean we're ignoring preferable, but you can't know what your preferable futures are until you have your arms around what's probable. If your preferable is in the basket that says probable, that's an interesting conversation we'll have up the road. And so this first phase, this phase 3, the first of 2 in so far as futuring processes, and where your futurists in each of your committees will be, your teams will be leading the charge on this mostly, is where you begin to squeeze the probables that you think your information gathering, your purposing suggests most strongly. And so that's the goal for this phase. You're going to generate possible, probable, and preferable futures that your analyses may suggest. And you're probably going to look for more, for additional research, and certainly you're going to engage in deeper conversation and engagement with your team members and probably with the other team as well. It might look something like this. Union President Ulysses looks at a futures wheel, which is one of the techniques you're going to use. And he asks, how do we do this? How do we use a futures wheel to forecast the future? Now, since the Union President is part of the education and leadership team, the assistant superintendent in the ELT is the futurist. And what she's going to offer is not one specific future, Ulysses, but instead we're going to use this device to help us identify the possible, the probable, and the preferable ones, particularly the probable ones. And Ulysses asks, naturally, how? And basically, she will go forward, and your futurist can explain how you do a futures wheel. An example of this might be that we might say, well, if things continue the way they are, if there's a brain drain in our community, in our school district population, perhaps the property values might drop. And then someone's going to say, well, based on our information, we can see how property values dropping is going to hurt the tax base. Well, if the tax base goes south, then the pupil personnel director points out, well, we might have to be aware that we might have a population that's moving in that will be more economically needy. And we're going to have to figure out how we're going to finance our needs to adjust for what those students and population may need. In other words, what you're going to do is you're going to engage in an if-then graphic to explain and to consider what goes on. And once you do that, you're going to go to a third dimension, rather a third process. I should have mentioned that the first process will be trend extrapolation, and we'll talk more about that in a separate video. That separate forecasting skill would be what we call cross-impact matrixing or charting, where you're going to try to look at how the futures that you project impact each other. And in realizing what those impacts are, you're going to begin to squeeze down to what you think the 3 or 4 probable futures will be. You don't walk out the door in phase 3 without having 3 or 4 probable futures that your team will have voted on and will have presented to the other team and vice versa. And that you will have shared with each other, perhaps at the start of water cooler or through emails and texts and Facebooks and rather FaceTimes and Zooming and Skype and whatever other video software is available to you at this point in time, where you're going to begin to collect around what you think is going to happen. So between the 3 forecasting skills I'm alluding to, trend extrapolation, futures wheels, and cross-impact matrix, you're going to come out the other side of this tunnel with a pretty good idea of what you think the probable futures are for your district or for your community. As I said before, your hair's going to hurt because you're going to be negotiating with each other, trading influence cards, using the weight of your role to vote. But in the end, both teams will have probably similar, but not necessarily identical futures to consider as we move to phase 4. And you'll have muscles and skills that few leaders typically have, and more importantly, muscles and skills that are rarely infused and embedded in the culture of the conversation and the planning of a given organization, he said smugly.